think we're ready.
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Gretchen. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Community Policing Performance Audit Steering Committee for January 14th. Actually, Courtney, would you mind please calling the roll?
Yeah, so that was today. So
sorry about that. I'd be happy to. So Jody, you're here. Thank you. DC Burke.
Here.
And Ashley Hamilton. And Levy is with us.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome. And Casey, you've already announced, but if you wouldn't mind.
I am still here.
Thank you. And Cindy?
Here.
Thank you. Scotty?
Here.
And Oni?
I'm here.
Thank you so much. And then we have other staff that are hanging out.
Yeah, why don't we go ahead and do introductions with the other staff, Courtney, if you wouldn't mind, starting with city staff, and then Bob, I'll lean on you for the Hilliard-Hines staff.
Sure.
Perfect. Deb, would you start us off?
Yes, Debbie Aguilar, Salem Police.
And Gretchen?
Sure. Gretchen Bennett, City of Salem, Mayor and City Manager's Office.
Thank you. And Kirsten? Well, Kirsten was on another call, so she'll probably join us in just a second, but she is here. And we don't have an attorney, so behave. And then I'm Courtney, and I work in the City Manager's Office. Thanks so much.
So on the Hilliard-Hines team, we have Ricky Godey, Brian Kaufman, and joining us tonight is Rob Davis, who's the practice lead in the law enforcement consulting group. So he's actually my boss. He's checking in on me, make sure I'm behaving myself as well. So.
Great. Thank you all. Welcome. Good to see everyone again. As we get started here, I just wanted to call out, you have two items to take a look at in your email. You have the agenda for tonight, and then a separate email came, I think, to us on the 12th with a document that we'll be looking at tonight. So thank you. And let's see, I don't know if we mentioned, but Anne Marie Banfield will be joining us before 5, so we'll have a full roster tonight. So taking a look at the agenda, we'll go through our approval of minutes, which came attached with the agenda. We'll also spend some time talking through best practice and trends in community policing. We asked for an overview of what Hilliard-Hines is experiencing and noticing from other police departments for us to know and understand. And then we'll step into those key audit themes and concepts, and then talk through next steps. We're a little longer tonight, and thank you for that tonight. We thought that this might be a time that we might spend longer, so we wanted to prepare for that. So thank you for that. And then we'll adjourn. Is there any items or changes to the agenda that anybody has? Okay. So we will move forward with approval of the minutes. So we would entertain a motion to approve those, or if we have changes to recommend.
I'll move to approve the minutes.
Thank you, Scotty. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
I missed who what that was.
I'll let Ashley take it.
All right, I'll
Ashley,
second.
thank you. I have a second. So all those in favor of the approving the minutes as written, say aye.
Aye.
Hi.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Thank you. I see Mark has joined us from our city attorney's office, so thank you, Mark. All right, I am going to turn it over, Bob, to you and your team for our first agenda item to talk through those best practice and trends in community policing.
So thank you very much, Jody. What we hope to do tonight is a couple things. One, we thought it was important to have some backdrop to the report, also give everybody an appreciation of what we're seeing across the nation with respect to where the state of policing is, and also some of the concepts that you will see in the audit reports. We want to make sure that there's some clarity about that. This is a higher level discussion, and we're hoping there'll be a discussion and questions, and please, anytime as we're discussing various aspects of policing, if you don't understand something and want greater clarification or want us to go deeper, we'll do that. Anything we talk about tonight is not directly connected back to the audit report or the audit process. It's really to kind of, as I said before, give you some context. Also, when you do see the report and you do see some recommendations or key findings, keeping in mind, well, that might be the state of affairs. So if we're making a recommendation about policing, doesn't necessarily mean that Salem is doing anything wrong. What it means is that they're in the mainstream, and really what we're trying to do with the audit report is talk about future direction of the police department. So there's going to be a grounding with respect to what we're finding in the context of community policing, which is part of the audit, but also really kind of giving you an understanding of where we see policing, and also from our perspective, because we've done a lot of work in this area, where we see the future direction of policing. I think the important distinction I want to make is we often talk about change and reform, and I see those as two very different concepts. Change is really incremental changes and overlaying on top of existing organizations. Reform is really changing the entire direction of policing and where it's going, redefining its policing mission, redefining its policing philosophy. So as we talk about change and reform, kind of keep that distinction in the back of your mind. And Rob, I just want to give you an opportunity to kind of just get a little more context, if you'd like, with respect to our conversation. All four of us are going to be talking about it interchangeably. We all bring different perspectives to the table. So I thought it was really good that you have four different perspectives, but kind of understanding what those general themes are.
Yes, and my understanding is that's exactly what this first item on your agenda should be, and that is seeing kind of those current trends that are going on around the country. And remember, we're taking this, or weighing in on this with the perspective of having been in dozens of cities over the last several years, including major cities, mid-sized cities like yours. I mean, we've been in Baltimore, we've been in Memphis, we've been in Miami, Fort Worth, Seattle, San Francisco, Oakland, and then we've been in places like Boulder, Colorado, other cities that are mid-sized cities and things like that. So what we're seeing, and not only seeing, but hearing in the discussions at places like the Major City Chiefs Association or the International Association of Chiefs of Police meeting, are some of the things I think we'd like to share with you tonight. So maybe, Bob, if you don't mind, I'll just kick off with a couple, and then
Sure.
Everybody else can weigh in. But clearly, one thing that Bob just mentioned should be underscored, and that is that, for many, many years now, people have said that they're doing community policing. And there are many agencies that have had great success with that. They have truly engaged with their community. They have increased their capacity to be able to interact with a variety of different groups within their agencies. But there are so many agencies that are just doing a superficial job. And really, that's not cutting it anymore. That community policing absolutely is important, but there's a different way of reimagining it, where it goes beyond just engaging with the community in a variety of different activities and things. And at times, if it's very successful, engaging them in ways which they are proactively collaborating with other entities and groups to try and solve problems. But this is really talking about reimagining it so that not only are the police departments engaging with the community, but they're actually inviting the community in. And what I mean by that is when you're creating policy, rather than just creating policy on the fly and saying, here's what our policy is, having people within the community that step up and say, hey, what about that use of force policy? Or what about the way that you do internal affairs investigations? And actually allowing them to have a voice and then roll up their sleeves and work together. So it's really taking it to another level. So if you're going to begin to hear this term, the reimagining of policing, but that's what we think it means. What we know that it means. It really should be changing the way that police do business, not just on a superficial level, but in a deep down DNA level, so that the community truly knows that there's a voice there at the police department. So I just wanted to underscore that because I know Bob feels the same way I do about that particular item and that issue. And we see that as a trend now in many cities across the country. We're working in Louisville right now as we speak, and we certainly see that that's something they're looking forward to do as well. One other thing I'll mention, Bob, and then I'll open it up because I don't want to take all the time talking about all of the issues, but we talk about de-escalation and use of force and things like this. We really are trying to figure out ways in the law enforcement profession to make sure that the officers understand the whys of it all. What does de-escalation really mean? Is it just a buzzword so that people can say we've given our officers training in de-escalation, or are the officers actually engaged at that street level of doing things to try and be a little bit more empathetic with the people in the community and figuring out ways to either address them, interact with them, et cetera. And that just takes us into a whole variety of other different things. So one last thing I'll mention that kind of is tied into that is that a number of agencies now are looking at the knowledge, skills, and abilities, or the KSAs, that they have used for years in terms of who it is they want to hire as a police officer in their community. And based upon what Bob and others I think have probably talked to you about, there's a very, very deep need to take a look at those freshly, to say, who is the person? What type of person do we actually want serving as a police officer in our communities today? And how might that be different than what they were looking for 30 or 40 or 50 years ago? But in any number of agencies where we've been, you'll take a look at those KSAs and their hiring processes with the human resources departments, and you'll find that those probably haven't been touched in decades. So it's not that there are bad things in there. It's not that should all be thrown out, but there are certainly ways to take a look at, what specific type of individual would be our ideal as we go out there and begin hiring and recruiting and things like that. So those are a few right off the top of the very high level ones that I'll mention. I have more, but I don't want to take up the whole time here. So I'll turn it back to you, Bob, in case you want to turn to Ricky and others.
Yeah. So I think one of the things you're going to find too, as we start to think about the future of policing and reimagining policing, is we're going to shy away from and move away from the notion of community policing, because when it was evolving in the late 70s, early 80s, it has now morphed into so many different meanings that it's almost become really hard to get your arms around and understand what we mean by community policing. As Rob indicated, a lot of agencies are doing some things really well. In fact, have really done really well in terms of the area of community policing. Other departments have done aspects of community policing really well. And so what we're moving towards as we think about reimagining policing is really is about this notion of partnerships with community, building trust and confidence in the police. But that also takes a real holistic approach in terms of policing and re-examining what policing is doing, and really kind of looking at that foundation of policing and seeing if, in many cases where community policing was kind of overlaid on top, trying to respond to issues as they evolved, is it time now to really think about a fundamental change and shift in the way police departments think about its role, its mission, its function, and also where is its attention should be. I mean, a lot of times police departments tend to look inward. They're very concerned about operations. They tend to some degree, and departments less so now, tend to become very siloed and isolated with the communities. They do their function separate and apart from everybody else, and they have a very unique function. They've always thought of themselves in that way, as opposed to seeing themselves as being more of a global collaborative partner, not just with the community, but also with other collaborative partners, and building an extension of an extended system across the city. And taking on so many different roles. As you know, over time, policing has really been confronted with a lot of different challenges that, back in the late 70s and 80s, policing really wasn't dealing to the level it has been doing with a lot of social issues that now have become the responsibility of the police department. And while that's going on, you're seeing other systems either failing over this time, and the police trying to take up an area, and it's really become overwhelming many times with the police department. So when we do a look at a police department, we try to figure out, is it really, it's kind of a business model. We look at it holistically. Is the department having alignment across the entire organization, or has it been experiencing those incremental changes where it gets somewhat disjointed, where you have some really good programs inside the department, or you have units within the department that are kind of doing their own thing, but there's not really a necessary connection. And where is the core mission of police departments? And many police departments, that core mission has gotten lost. I mean, if you ask most administrators, they'll tell you patrol is the backbone of the police department. It's the core of the police department. But in the culture of policing, many times, the first thing officers want to do is get out of patrol and get into these specialized assignments. And they become more important than the core mission of the police department. So it's really re-examining and going back to the fundamentals of understanding, where is the service delivery? Where is the touch point between the police and the community? And also, how are the police officers being empowered, or do we stay in a hierarchical organization really that's been proven to be kind of ineffective, and really where you have a lot more efficiencies, a lot more effectiveness by empowering the people that are out in the field, and really changing the dynamics between having direction and control versus guiding, mentoring, and coaching, so that officers feel like they're empowered to do things, but they're working collaboratively with one another and joining with one another. So I'm going to give Ricky and Brian a chance to see if there's anything, and Rob, if they wanted to add to that or augment that before I go on. And that's also, please, anytime during this conversation, ask questions. We're hoping this turns into a lively conversation. Otherwise, you're going to hear us talk for an hour and a half, and it's going to get very boring and dull. So we don't want to do that. We want to keep it lively. So,
Bob, maybe one thing, if I could just augment one thing you say, and then I'll kick it to Ricky, and Ricky can kick it to Brian. But you said a couple of things like buzzwords when we go into the cities where we're making assessments, or what we hear in agencies in general. But But if you go into an agency and you ask them about their community policing efforts, and the first thing they start talking about are their programs, and they start mentioning things like Coffee with a Cop and things like this. Look, there's nothing wrong with those. Those are great. Those are tools. They're part of a larger thing. But if an agency is really seeing its community policing programs in today's vernacular as being a program, it really isn't a philosophy that has permeated all of the operations of a department. And too often people see community policing as only being a patrol-centric function, when the reality is some of the best community policing is done at other levels within the department. And I'll give you but one example, and then I'll kick it to Ricky. But if you take a look at the investigators in an agency, you know, they may say, well, you're asking me about community policing, but that's a patrol-based function. What are you talking about? What am I doing with community policing? Well, if you've got a great community policing program or an effort like that going on within your investigators systems, you'll see operations like you might have a sexual assault unit. And they're not just investigating sexual assaults, but they are proactively engaging with nonprofit social service organizations and other government agencies that are dealing with the same problems. In other words, if all you're doing as an investigator for sexual assaults is just investigating sexual assaults and carrying cases over to the DA's office and crossing the T's and dotting the I's to get a case filed, you're not participating in the opportunity to try and drive down the root causes of those social issues that are driving the crime to begin with. But if you team up with nonprofits, social service organizations, and those other government agencies that are focusing on sexual assaults, all of a sudden you find that you can really get a synergy going on there and you can help each other address those issues. For example, what do police departments have that some of these other nonprofits might not have? Sure, they've got information on where some of the things are occurring, but who has the best information on exactly where the sexual assaults are occurring in any given town or city? It's the police department, because they're tracking it all, right? Now, granted, there may be some that are unreported, but for the most part, they've got great data. Why aren't they teaming up with the nonprofits and the social service organizations to be able to take their data and perhaps seek grants or other funding, because they've got their act together with how they're going to try and attack the problem and work together as a group? You'll also see where that sometimes leads to a situation where those sexual assault units are operating out of a center that are apart physically from the police department. And in that same center, they have a representative of the district attorney's office, the state's attorney's office, a member of the nonprofit group, et cetera. So I just wanted to augment what Bob was saying when we talk about, you know, community policing as people usually talk about it today. It's not just a patrol program. It should be something that every single entity within a police department says, what role could I play in my current position to try and proactively engage and work with the community to not just do the law enforcement piece of this, but to come together as a team to attack the root causes of these crimes to begin with. So again, these are some of the telltale things we see with very, very progressive agencies that are moving in that direction versus those that say, we're doing community policing because we meet with people once a month at a community meeting and have coffee and donuts together. It goes beyond that. So I just wanted to really augment what Bob was saying, because I think we're all pretty passionate about trying to see it move in another direction, so that our communities really are empowered to work with the police department and not, you know, just by their side. Ricky, I'll kick it to you. I know you probably have something you want to weigh in on.
You just said everything. The truth, no, I mean, really, you did nail it. A lot of what you just said was what I was going to say. But when you really look at community policing, I think that engagement, the collaboration, it's a process that every city, and it's not the same in every city because no two cities are exactly alike. So when it comes to community policing, it really is about the police department having a very organic and very strong collaborative relationship within all city departments, whether it be zoning, because the way it was always explained to me, because I was very involved in problem-oriented policing, if you're not familiar with problem-oriented policing, which is really about problem solving. Herman Goldstein, a professor out of the University of Madison, Wisconsin, started it many years ago. But I mean, at the core of what we do, it's the backbone because it's about problem solving. And you can talk about predictive policing, intelligence. I mean, there's all sorts of policing models. But at the end of the day, to truly get the community engagement and the community collaboration you want, you have to be able to solve the problems that are happening in your city. So if I'm a police officer, you know, and I'm in San Jose, I care about San Jose's problems. I don't care about Santa Clara's problems. Same thing with Salem. I mean, you're going to care about Kaiser's problems because they're right on your borders, and it's going to spill over. And to the extent that your Salem Police Department, your Kaiser Police Department are working together to solve those problems is key. And you're using all sorts of tools that you have from data. I mean, data is king when it comes to trying to predict where certain crimes are going to occur, who's going to be victims, who's going to be your next potential offenders, and how do we get in and stop it when we can identify that using the data? Then are we able to maybe prevent somebody from being arrested for something and maybe look for a diversion? That's where, law enforcement aided diversion, where you're using different social agencies to not just arrest people, but actually come together to help solve a bigger issue, a bigger problem. So, I mean, when it comes to community policing, and we're talking about it, it really is this collaborative overall engagement. And I don't remember whether it was Bob or Rob who said that, empowerment about police officers. When you send police officers out in the field and you say, I want you to know your community members, I want you to know your districts, I want you to know your beats, I want you to this is your problems, figure out ways to solve them. Empower your officers to come up with some great ideas that don't always involve arrests. There was a standard when I used to teach problem-oriented policing, and we say 85% of what we do, and I think Deputy Chief Burke and all the rest of the police officers, Scotty, will tell you 85% of what we do cannot involve an arrest. It has to do with trying to figure out, ways to direct people, and who's the first line of any government that people see. If there's a problem, people call the police. Most of what we go to, we can't solve with an arrest. So we have to know who our partners are in the community. We have to know the places that we can go to help us solve those problems. We need to be able to direct people to the issues and move on from there. So solving a problem in community engagement, like I said, it has to do with police officers kind of be this generalist specialist that knows a little bit about everybody in the city and everywhere to turn and who to go to get the problems, even if it's as simple as a health and safety violation, to know where to do it. Because I mean, you really do get called to scenes where that's the complaint. How many police officers know that? I've been to scenes, but I know who to call. I knew to have them call, and if I have to go the red tape for them to help them, that's kind of how I view, in a nutshell, very, I guess, layman terms, but it's the best way that I can describe what community policing is to me. It really is this collaboration, engagement, empowerment for us to go out and solve the problems. So Brian, you can take it.
All right, thanks, Ricky. Yeah, and I think if you look at our approach to this actual performance audit, where we started, and I think it's representative of what we're promoting in the report and the principles of community policing. Because as you all know, we started with the community. I can tell you, reaching out to 38 plus different stakeholders, partners, and different individuals that wanted to be a part of the performance audit. I can tell you from my experience, that's and it was brief, but it was a broad net to really open up for us. And we spent a pretty significant amount of our time, trying to reach out to as many of those representatives as we could to, first get their perspectives, to try to gain a better understanding of what some of the challenges were when you look at community police relations, community practices, and I mean a whole range of different elements that goes into public safety and working and promoting the principles of community policing. And the fact that you have the diversity on this group is pretty unique in itself. And I don't know if you fully understand or I think can appreciate that. I mean, I think what Salem is doing here with this, and we've had a lot of discussion with our team of kind of the uniqueness of this advisory group or of this process. And Rob and Bob both can probably say that this is a little unique, where you have this type of a forum to really have these types of discussions. And I think probably, 20, 30 years ago and maybe longer, you wouldn't see this kind of a makeup in a police performance audit. You would see a group going into the department, not really being as inclusive with the outside influences that really make up the department. Because as everybody knows, the department is only as successful as the community support and trust that they have in that department. So I think you should all be, I think, very proud of the process. And the nice part, again, about what we're doing with your assistance is this really isn't a crisis situation. Because if you look across the country, there's a lot of department community in crisis. And when I say crisis, I mean they're literally not able to function. And you see that. And I think everybody would agree, I think to some extent, that the city of Salem, and when I say that, I'm not just talking about the police, I'm talking about, everything that makes up the city, really isn't in a level of crisis where they can't function and operate. Yes. Are there challenges? Absolutely. Are there always going to be issues? Yes, absolutely. If there wasn't, no one here would have a job and no one would really, continue to, I think, but well, let me rephrase that. No one would continue to try to solve those if there wasn't a way for some resolution or continued growth in the midst of all the challenges going on. So, even though Salem, this is one project for Hillard Hines, I can tell you, Salem, whether it's Salem or Baltimore or any other, Louisville or Ferguson, all of these initiatives and efforts contribute to moving public safety and law enforcement and communities to a better place. I think that's the goal of everybody. Everybody has a piece. So even though it's isolated to Salem and you're dealing with the challenges, trying to address some challenges in the city of Salem, I can tell you, and like Robin knows, there's best practice publications. Everybody is learning and sharing from each other. And I think that is overall going to contribute to the national approach to public safety and law enforcement, because I think if it doesn't happen, as you all see what's going on around the country, if it isn't that national commitment, there's going to be continued, I think really challenges and issues for public safety and community relations. But, again, I think we started with the community focusing on that, and we had a lot of discussion. Why are we focusing so heavily on the community component of this? Well, because the very premise of community policing isn't policing the community, it's community policing and making sure that those connections, those relationships, those partnerships, that level of trust, that level of commitment, I mean, you can go down the list. And if you look at when we did our phase 1 key themes, we had those areas that were overarching through the whole project. And I know, this is just one small step as you move forward. After this audit's done. Then I think becomes the real work is then how do you then take that and really move that forward? And I think we've all agreed right now that there's an opportune time for that, with the change with the new chief, changes in some of other influence. Yes, there's always going to be obstacles, setbacks, events that will push you back. But I think the goal of everybody, and at least in this audit, is to continue to move things forward and give you some good recommendations, some good starting points or some continued starting points to work on as you move well beyond the performance audit. So we certainly had our challenges and, a little bit hesitant with some of the discussions, but those are the powerful discussions that have to happen. And we acknowledge that. I think I speak for the team. We acknowledge that, we know that, and hopefully we demonstrated that, even though they're hard, difficult discussions with some really challenging issues to deal with, you just have to address them. And I think we've got a good start to help you with this report in its conclusion. So certainly you should all be commended. I didn't hear anybody, and I think Ricky knows that because we were on some calls, and even Bob, that at the end of those discussions, we didn't say, oh my gosh, this will never work or this is terrible. Passionate people, when you have passionate people with sincere commitment to really improving things, that's what comes out and that's what we experience. So I think, at least my experience, very positive. You should all be proud in the process at this point of all the people that have been involved so far.
I wonder if we could pause here for just a minute and make sure that there aren't any lingering kinds of bigger picture questions about community policing and any of the aspects that might have been included in the audit. And if people had kind of a bigger picture question, we talked a little bit about de-escalation and use of force. That was one area of the audit. We talked a lot about community policing, and we talked a little bit about hiring practices and recruitment practices. Those are all areas within the audit. And I wonder if anyone wanted to address a specific question about any kind of best practice that people are seeing in the nation on an area.
Okay, I'll do it.
Debbie, I thought you weren't going to say anything tonight.
I know, and Scotty knows I'm going to get a text here in a second.
If you didn't, Jody was going to start going through the list.
I
So
know, that's why I did it. Go ahead, Scotty, give me your shocked look. So I guess, I don't know if this is a question or a comment more so. I'm curious as we really move forward and looking back, I mean, some of us started law enforcement in the 80s when the term community policing was a term that was used to start putting programs together and really working with our community and developing that partnership and all the things that we did in the early stages of community policing. And one of the things that I've thought about is that really still the term? And I know you guys talk buzzwords and things like that, but is that really still the term that's appropriate? Because as we start to look more at what we're doing, I think we need to move beyond the concepts of community policing to the concepts of community engagement. And what does that really look like? And what does true engagement look like? And what does true partnership look like? And what is relationship? And so I'm just curious, nationally, as you take a look at these things, is it more about engagement or is it still the term community policing?
Well, from my perspective, and then everybody else can weigh in as well, I think you're making some great points, Chief, and that is that let's go back to the 80s when they started the heavy discussions about community policing. Make no mistake, there were a lot of good things that came out of that, but we begin to see that now as being the start. In fact, if you really think about it, the goal should be not to call it community policing, because what we see as the ideal way to do policing, which a lot of people think as community policing or reimagined policing, should just be policing. So in other words, there should be no distinction between community policing and policing. If you've achieved the type of policing you really want, why do you have to use the term community? Because that's policing that you now do within your city, if you follow me. It permeates everything. It's a philosophy that goes everywhere. But I think what we're seeing now is that they're going beyond the program, because part of the problem with just calling it community policing, and you even use the term, we created programs. All of a sudden, those programs began to create firewalls where people would say, okay, our community policing unit is doing the community policing for our entity. And so it was like somebody over here is doing it. When the reality is that everybody should be doing it at some level in any way they can with where they stand, lift where you stand. So there was this tendency for the community policing programs all of a sudden to be siloed, and people began to see them that way. And then you can have agencies say, we're absolutely 100% engaged in community policing because we do coffee with a cop, or because we meet with homeowners associations every other month or something. But you'd go to the officers themselves and talk to them, and you could ask them, what's the number one situation or problem or social issue that your team on swing shift in this district is working with your sergeant to try and address with the community? And you get a blank stare. What do you mean? I just handle calls for service. In other words, I think just by calling it community policing programs, we have siloed ourselves a little bit. And what Bob and I and others are saying is we've got to totally reimagine that, reform how we look at that. It can't just be a program. It has to be something that permeates everything that goes on within the agency. And that's where we begin to move. And again, my goal would be to get to a point where everybody's doing that. And that's what policing is. So you no longer have to call it community policing. You're just doing policing as it should be done. So I think, calling it that is an issue, because it also kind of tends to indicate that there's a program going on with the police department, and that also begins to cut out the community. I have not even seen a good quote unquote community policing program unless it's not just that they're engaging with the community or meeting with the community, it's that they're rolling up their sleeves and working hand in hand. They literally are working hand in hand. So it's like, they should be waking up in the morning saying, I'm the lieutenant in charge of the, child exploitation unit. What entities are there out there that I can help? How can I help them? It's not just a matter of how the community can help us as police officers. How can we help them? So it has to go beyond just the program stage or the definition stage, and just become, how do we proactively work with the community side by side and allow that community to have a voice in how we're doing it? It's not just the old days where you come to the police department, we'll tell you what we need you to do to be effective in our community policing program. Well, they're using those pronouns, our program, our department, come visit with us. Look, it's a single community. So how can I help you? What is your program? How can we create a quote unquote effort together? And I think that's the mental change that we're beginning to see progressive agencies make. They're beginning to take it to another level, so that perhaps we will leave that term community policing behind because of all the baggage that is attached to it, as we begin to recognize what it means to actually, work with, engage with, collaborate with, roll your sleeves up with, know each other on a first name basis, and go out there and try and solve the root causes of the social issues that drive crime to begin with. It's to everybody's advantage. I mean, there are some innovative agencies that have taken on the homeless issue. We see very innovative agencies that are coming up with new ways to address how they deal with the people who are experiencing mental health crises. And they can't solve those problems on their own. For decades, they just kind of kicked that can over, especially in California. They cut so much funding to the mental health programs that all of a sudden, all the outcome or the bad outcomes of those social policies landed in the laps of the police officers, and people aren't happy with that response, nor should they be. It's a collective effort to try and address those issues. So I'll get off my bandwagon and my passionate plea here, but I think, Chief, I appreciate what you said, because I think that kind of a discussion is what leads people to understanding that this has to go to another level. And I know Bob Haas is just as passionate about it as I am, so I'll give you the floor again, Bob, if you want to weigh in.
No, I think it's a great. Go ahead, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Cindy.
Cindy.
So my comment to all of this, and I agree with Deputy Chief Burke, is that the title of what we're talking about is something that needs to change. And I've spent 25 years in this community, and 20 of them in social service, helping those that are struggling in poverty. And our industry, our social service web industry, knew we weren't doing our job very well because we need to collaborate more. If you're going to get to outcomes, one agency cannot solve everything. There's partnerships that need to be engaged. And it takes years to get everybody to move in the same direction. And over the last several years, there's been some phenomenal things done in the Salem, Kaiser, Marion County, Polk County area, driven by those social services. You mentioned earlier law enforcement in an agency. Well, that's called co-location. We've been doing that as a social service model for years, and you get great outcomes when you have this organization, this organization, this organization, and this organization together, helping that one client move to a place of stability for which they feel stable. And you've eliminated the barrier of them traveling around and trying to find all those services when all 5 of them are co-located in that one area. So I think our community is primed for that engagement. I think our community in the social service area, as well as some other partners, are already transforming and have been transforming a service model like that for years. And I think the word community policing is maybe still where that authoritative thing might have a brush with some people. It's a collaborative model, it's co-location. And talking about getting to the root problem, I mean, if we know statistically that we have a high auto theft area and it's in this geographic area, what are we going to do with those neighbors? What are we going to do in that neighborhood association? How are we going to educate and pull everybody to address that issue that's affecting that geographic location? And then, I mean, that's a tiny thing in the sense, but when you start looking at bigger social issues and people do call 911 and want law enforcement to clean it up, and there's a lot of times that there is no authority to clean that up. So what are we as the community going to come alongside, co-locate our knowledge, our skills, our resources to address those issues?
Great comments. And I think, Bob, you may want to share your thoughts on what we define as co-produced policing.
Oh, no, the deputy had his hand raised. I don't want to cut him off.
I'm sorry, I missed that. My apologies.
Well, and I don't know if this is the time to do this or not, and I don't even formally know how to make the motion, but where I'm heading with this is I really think that a motion is in order to actually change the title of what it is that we're doing. And I think calling it a community policing audit is probably not the best way to go about it. If community policing as a term brings about thoughts of programs rather than true change in an organization. So I don't know what to call it, and I don't know how to make the motion necessarily, other than to say that I'd like to make a motion that we explore options in what we would name this audit versus a community policing audit.
Well, I'll second that for you, DC Burke.
Thank you, Casey. Discussion?
Since I seconded it, I'll just say this real quick because I want to hear from other people. I do think the language is important. I think when people hear policing, just the term policing, it gives you imagery, right? You know, I had the good fortune this week of, and Cindy was just talking a little bit about this, and to a lesser extent, I think Bob was too. But I had the good fortune this week of visiting one of the warming shelters and touring that, and talking to some of the folks there about the unsheltered population and interactions with police, and not that they're bad or good, but just that on those occasions that are non-criminal in nature, where 911 is called, and the only individual that can go is just a patrol officer for a situation that doesn't necessarily require a patrol officer. And so when we're talking about community policing, I think reimagining it as Mr. Davis was talking about it, I think is a good way to go, and to really reimagine it and put it in the minds of people what we're really talking about. If we're talking about a cross-functional, coordinated effort, then it's not just policing, it's more than that. And what is that, and how do you brand it in such a way that it really imprints the image of it on people's minds? And I think that's important, because then it helps you build goals and objectives and then work toward those. So I'm all for it.
So one of the things that Rob is kind of leading to, and I think this really touches on Deputy Chief's perspective, is that I can tell you that everything, when we talk about conventional community policing, the model we're looking at, the reform we're talking about, has an opposite impact in terms of everything from organizational structure, the role of the officers within the department, where the authority lies within the department. And when we talk about that engagement, we're talking about a concentrated and deliberate effort to reach out to the community, especially those communities that don't have that trust, don't have that comfort with the police, and start to rebuild those relationships. What tends to happen in many police departments is they will form partnerships and collaborations with people they're comfortable with, that people are willing to come to them. But what about the rest of the community that really needs the service of policing? The thing that used to really bug me early on as a young policeman 40 years ago was the very communities that need us the most, we basically treat the worst. And I'm not too sure that hasn't changed over time. And really what we're talking about is really thinking about the police making a concerted effort to make sure that they're inclusive of the entire community, all segments of the community. What we've been talking about at Hillard Hines, and we've been working a lot, and it really comes from all our years of experience, is this notion of co-production of public safety. So we're getting away from this whole notion of community policing and not even refer to it. In fact, when you hear us talk, you'll never hear us refer to policing as law enforcement. That is a very small function of that agency, but yet police departments tend to gravitate and latch onto that term, and we don't think it's really appropriate. And to Casey's point, I think it conjures up images that really are harmful, or really building that wedge between the community and the police. The notion of co-production of public safety really is the police department rethinking about its overall mission, its function, how it measures itself in terms of metrics, right? What should we be measuring? And the conventional measures that we used to use really don't hold true, because what they really are is not really an indication of anything. So when we talk about crime, we talk about number of arrests, number of citations. What does that really tell you about the police department and its relationship with the community? Nothing. What we're talking about is community sentiment. How does the community feel about the police department? How does it feel about its own safety and its level of trust within the agency? Those are key measurements and outcome measures as you engage in this notion of that collaborative and that partnering with other agencies. So that co-production of public safety is the notion that it's a shared responsibility, not just the police department taking it on itself in terms of providing and promoting public safety, but really, how does the community, the police, and its other partnering agencies work in a collaborative fashion?
I think we might have just lost Bob. Making sure it's not just me. Oh, there we go. There you go. Are you back, Bob?
Internet.
I know what's going on.
Just lost you there as you were closing your sentence, I think.
Oh, good. So so I think when we talk about that notion of it is really thinking about policing altogether very differently. The notion when Rob keeps on talking about reimagining policing is really thinking about policing very different. Don't get stuck in the old models or thinking about staying on that foundation, but really thinking about what the police department could be. And I think Cindy touched upon this too, is the police department cannot continue to expand to try to take on all the responsibilities that it's encountering. It really needs to find partners that can help them and be a force multiplier with each other, right? So that we're extensions of those systems in terms of working collaborating with one another and being maybe the front end or a social service provider or a follow-on end for a social service provider, and making sure the welfare and safety of folks who need the service the most really have have the ability to have that touch point, particularly with an officer. And when an officer comes, is not fearful that they're going to do something that's going to be harmful, but really there as a helping agent. And I know Levy put his hand up, so I want to keep on going.
Thumbs up.
If I could make a comment, coming from one of those partners who works very closely with law enforcement, we have the mobile crisis teams. We work with 2 Salem teams. We work with the sheriff's office. I've been doing crisis intervention training with our region since 2006. One of the things that I have felt very strongly in the last few years is it's really time for us to educate our community about what law enforcement can and can't do. And there are so many times when I'm being asked to reach out to a home for intellectual and developmental persons and talk to them about not using police as their behavior modification for that person, because then that person's fearful to call the police when they're in danger and their safety is at risk. And so I really feel, as we talk about this concept, I feel really strongly that we put so many things that we just think the police are going to do. And we don't, we've done a ton of training for law enforcement about how to engage with people, in my case, particularly with persons who have mental illness or maybe having psychosis. And we really have to put an effort into the community itself, not just our partners, but the people who would be receiving that service, primarily families. It's so painful to watch parents of adult children who are going through this process and often having a lot of their first contact with law enforcement because they're the concerns that are going on, the ways that they are learning to handle themselves, our law enforcement is being called. So I really like having our mobile crisis teams. I think it's made a big difference in how we're able to engage people. I'm really pleased with the fact that less than 3% of the people who are engaged by our mobile crisis teams actually go to jail or get a new charge. But it's some of that same work and some of the really moving towards educating our community on some of the things that law enforcement can or cannot do based on the 9th Regional Circuit Court that we need to be working together on, because there are some very unrealistic expectations out there.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. And I'm mindful that we have a motion on the table. I am going to go around the room and see if there are any other discussion points from our steering team before we get going. Please, Scotty, before we vote.
Also, though, Levy does have his virtual hand up.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I didn't realize that.
Levy was ahead of me, so let him go first.
Yes, I thought it was a thumbs up, so I suppose that works just the same.
At first, it was a thumbs up. Now,
oh, okay. Thank you.
No, I just wanted to support the motion, and I think I appreciate Deputy Chief's motion on this, because it is true, and I know the families that with whom I work, I have experienced that that some community policing efforts they might say that they become entry points to policing. So it's more about being police, more about those negative engagements, and that's because of that natural fear, because of that bias, because of previous experiences from other countries where they don't have good relationships with police. So all of that comes forth when they just see the officers. They don't see the special work that they're doing. So it is. I think I do appreciate that, and that we're talking about this and looking at it as reimagining policing and law enforcement, because also it's been my experience that in our community, I think we've taken a philosophy that, you know, putting good programs in the law enforcement and in the courts is the way that we try to get people to force people to go through programs that we think might help them. And I've seen that with many of the youth that we've worked with and with some other folks where that is an approach that we've taken in the past. And I don't know that it's been very effective. So I'm having been out of touch for a couple of months, I think, here and where the conversation is, I think I'm very grateful for being on this committee and for everybody that's been working. So I support the motion. Yeah.
Thank you, Levy. Any other steering members? Scotty, yes, of course.
Just had to say something since George Burke did. No, I had a question for Rob and Bob, having been doing this for a few years. What are you seeing, a few years or a couple years post audit? Are you seeing different success based on like number of officers per thousand? I hear you guys talking a lot about great ideas, and when the rubber hits the road for our officers, there's oftentimes an officer will say, "Hey, we have this issue in our district we really want to work on," and so they'll get assigned a project car, and then 2 people call in sick and the project car is canceled. Unlike a lot of companies who could maybe shut down productivity or shut down production and kind of retool, we just don't get that luxury. We're 24/7, 365, and the calls don't stop coming to have time to kind of stop and readjust and say, hey, how are we doing things? So I was wondering what the different effectiveness, what have you seen different effectiveness from the agencies? And does it have any correlation to the number of officers per 1,000 citizens they have? Because I know we're very low compared to the nation.
I like this conversation too, and I think we might go into a little bit more detail. And I wonder if you might entertain that we go ahead and vote on the motion on the table and then have that discussion if that works for you. George, Deputy?
Yeah, George works just fine. So my motion didn't really have a lot of focus other than the fact of moving to come up with a name. So as we've been sitting here talking, and I've been trying to think of how we would, I guess, amend that and actually name it. And I think something along the lines of, is this truly a community engagement audit? Because it goes to what Scotty's talking about right now, which talks about how are we performing in our areas of engagement, and what barriers do we have to actually performing at a higher level? And I think that's really what we need to take a look at. And then, both from an internal and an external perspective. So I guess to amend my motion, which could bring about some more conversation, would be to rename this, the audit itself as an audit on community engagement.
All right, so I might look to Mark for help on this, but we have a change in the motion that's on the floor, and we would need to have a second for that motion that's on the floor. Is that right? Or do we need to go back and ask Casey if he would agree to a change?
You have to ask Casey if he would agree to a change.
And Casey, how do you feel about that change? And if we need to be more clear, maybe Kristen has the notes on exactly the motion now. Kirsten.
The motion that I'm hearing is the motion on the table was to change the title of what we're doing, and Casey seconded. There's a friendly amendment, I would call it. I don't know, Mark, you might object to my terminology, but the amendment is to change it to the audit on community engagement. And then the question is whether that works for Casey, and if he would agree to second it again, and then we could have a vote.
Well, I'll second it for discussion, certainly.
Mark, you need to be ready, because this is going to get beyond my Robert's Rules experience.
I'll do the best that I can. So right now, the discussion is about the amendment which is to give it a specific name proposed by DC Burke.
Correct, to community engagement from community policing.
I like the change to community engagement. That's a positive action. That's what we're trying to bring about, is more community involvement, more reaching out and more reaching in both ways. Community policing audit to me sounds very authoritative, and it has a negative connotation in two very key words within that title. So
I also agree with Cindy. I think that this has a lot more to do with just the police taking ownership, that the community also needs to take ownership. And I like the idea of the community engagement to help with those conversations. I'm gonna go around the room. Oni, any comments you'd like to add?
Yes. So language does matter. And, you know, and so I'm all for the name change, but, and you can change the name all you want, but and I keep hearing suggestions, and rightfully so, about the community engagement being about partnering with different agencies and institutions. And what comes up for me is the institutional racism that exists that we don't deal with. So it's really important to pay attention to the institutions that you're connecting with, because you can connect with the ones you've always connected with and get the same outcome and still leave other groups, certain groups out, certain parts of the community that don't get to the benefits of this community engagement, don't get to grow, don't get to build relationship, get to keep the same mindset or think what we've always thought about law enforcement or policing. So I think that's really important, that yes, we can change language, and language matters, but it's also, we need to be really intentional about, after the name change, ensuring that when we're talking about connecting with community, that we are really talking about connecting with the whole community.
Thank you. Ashley, Deputy Burke, I saw your hand.
Oh, and I guess as the person who made the motion, what I want to clarify, and I think Oni hits it on the head, is we're not talking about agencies. We're talking about people. We're talking about community. We're talking about how do we better engage our community. We do it through partnerships with agencies, but we also do it by partnering with our community. And so that is the key here. And how do we engage, and how do we strengthen those relationships, and how do we reduce those barriers that we have with parts of community that doesn't feel safe even having conversations with law enforcement. So that's the effort. That's the reason for the change, not to focus on other agencies, but to focus on our engagement with our community.
Thank you. Ashley, any comments you'd like to offer, or questions or thoughts?
Absolutely. Just something really quick on a positive note. I do believe the name change is absolutely responsive to the work that we're looking to continue doing, not only as a community, but within the police department and all these systems that coincide for the benefit of our citizens. It was addressed really well by Oni that it has good intentions, but there needs to be follow through along with the name change, and recognizing that it's going to take a lot of work in rebuilding these relationships and really talking about what does accessibility and equity look like within these systems and conversations. So great start, but and hopefully it leads to even great, more fulfilling conversations and systems development, but it's just step one.
Yeah, good conversation. And I know I want to get back to what Scotty's point was. I wonder if we're at a point where we're ready to vote on the motion, and then we'll come back to more of that conversation. Does that work for folks?
So technically, we're taking a vote on the friendly amendment first, and then the name change second. Right, Mark?
Yes, Courtney, that's correct.
Okay, so we have a motion on the floor that has been amended, and we are taking a vote on the amended motion that has been seconded by Casey. And can you reiterate what that motion is?
We're taking a vote first on the amendment to call it Audit on Community Engagement. And then with that, if that should be approved, then we're taking a vote on the original motion, which was to change the name. Sorry.
Okay. So the motion on the floor is to change the name, and then we're going to go back to, is that a approval to change the name? Okay. All right. So the motion on the floor is to change the name to from community policing to community engagement, as motioned by Deputy Burke, seconded by Casey. So all those in favor, raise your hand or say aye.
Aye.
I think that's anyone opposed? Great. So that motion passes. Now we take a motion. Now we're voting on the motion to actually change the name. Okay. So the motion on the table from Deputy Burke is to change the name of the audit, with a second by Casey, and all those in favor say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Okay, thank you. And I want to get right back into Scotty and your point. I think this might open up some other conversations. So I thank you for pausing on that for a moment. So if you wouldn't mind framing up your question again, or if Rob's ready to talk, we can go there.
I can certainly, I remember the question, so I can certainly jump in, but I clearly want to make sure that Bob, Ricky, and Brian can weigh in here anytime. I don't want to just take the floor and run with it when they have something to say. But one thing that struck me, Scotty, and what you raised was, we can talk a lot about how we want to change things and those goals that we have in terms of kind of reimagining our policing, but you're absolutely right that there have to be some objective and measurable ways of being able to track what it is we're doing. How do we actually put that into practice? And I think there's kind of an instinct with a lot of people that they think, well, if we change this, there won't be as much of a need to have these officers doing things, or we could, reduce numbers, whatever you want to call it. The reality is what you're trying to do is you're trying to empower the officers to have more time to actually engage in that. I mean, there's kind of a standard out there. There may be some disagreement amongst my own team about what that number should be, but we were always shooting to get what we called 40% free patrol time, so that those officers weren't handling calls for service on 40% of their time out there in the field, so that they could work collaboratively with others and with community members to start to address these issues that they have on their plate. So that if there's a team out there working in a district on a swing shift, and they know what their problems are and who in the community that they're going to be working with. And I really like what Oni had to say. I believe I'm saying her name correctly, that it's not just the nonprofit social services, et cetera. It's the people in the neighborhoods themselves. I mean, how are they interacting with these individuals and listening to them, and not just talking down to them, but listening to them and then working with them. Those things can't occur if the officers don't have what we would call free patrol time or proactive patrol time. In fact, patrol time probably isn't even the definition. There should be another way to change even that. But the point would be this: you want to be able to empower those folks. And let me back up also. This gets to what Bob Haas was mentioning a moment ago. These officers, these personnel need to feel empowered. An officer in the field who's trained well and has a great grasp of what's going on within that particular neighborhood where they're working should be empowered to be able to make some decisions about things that he or she will be doing to interact with that community and move forward, or to bring ideas back and have them supported by the supervisors in the rank and file all the way up to the chief of police, as should the investigators, and as should all of these other individuals. They need to be empowered. And if they don't have the time to do that, it is very difficult to implement this type of a philosophy. My point being, and I'll summarize it and turn it over to Bob Haas. If all you have are officers responding from call to call to call to call to call to call, that does two things. First of all, it doesn't give them the time to try and implement this philosophy in the work that they're doing. And secondly, if they're just going from call to call to call to call to call, that leads to burnout. It leads to a situation where they're not connecting with the community, because all of a sudden they're just responding to calls with widgets out there so they can clear the calls and get on. There has to be this human element to what it is that they're doing. So they have to receive the training, they have to receive the direction, they have to have proper supervision, they have to have support from the management of the department, and they have to be empowered to be able to go out there and do those things, and then be given the time to do it. So all of those things can be translated into measurable objectives, but it can, as Bob Haas said, change the whole organization. I mean, how do you now train your supervisors when they're promoted to sergeants? How do you now have a command officer or a lieutenant who realizes that her responsibility isn't just to, come up with scheduling or something, but to really understand what it is these sergeants and officers are saying, this is the issue we have in our particular neighborhood. Here's what we think about doing. How can you support us? It's a whole different way of thinking, but it takes time. So I think that one thing that just really stood out that you mentioned, Scotty, was that issue about how much time these officers have, or if you have enough officers to be able to do it. It's not a simple thing to do. And as the other individual said, I think it was Cindy, these things take time. It takes time to be able to make these changes. I believe it was Cindy that stated that. But Bob, let me turn the floor over to you so that we can have you weigh in on this as well.
So there's actually two important dimensions, and one key dimension of what we haven't talked about at all, which I want to make sure we give ourselves enough time to talk about. But going back to Scotty's point, and I think what Oni talked about, is this notion of officers having the ability to be able to contact, reach, touch, and talk to people in non-adversarial, non-confrontational ways. And officers don't do that because many times the calls for service drive what the police are doing, as opposed to the police department managing its calls for service, finding ways to reduce those chronic repetitive calls for service so officers have more uncommitted time so they engage. But there is a balance in terms of making sure that you still are responsive to the basic calls for service while still being able to give officers meaningful time to engage. And that's deliberate. It's not just randomly driving around, but really making sure that they use that uncommitted time in a way that is designed to build those relationships, that's designed to build that trust, that's to give people an opportunity to learn and know people, as one another. Relationships are not are not a complicated compound. In fact, it's very simple. I will trust somebody who I know. I'll not just trust somebody who's wearing a uniform, but I need to know those people, which means it's got to be repeated contact. And it's got to be contact in a way that I demonstrate through my actions and my words that I can be trusted and that I can be looked upon as being a helpful agent in terms of dealing with issues that you're dealing with. And it's not just one way of going that way. We've often found that police are often contained by the community justice system. We're saying that it's a much broader system. It can't be the criminal justice system that defines what we do. It really has to be that social network, that social service system that's much broader in terms of how we engage folks, how we make sure people are getting the service they need, how we are sure that we can go to our partners and get people connected where they need to go, and especially people who are in need and desperate need and don't know where to go and in crisis. Who's there to make sure that they can help navigate and advocate for those folks going forward, which means you officers have to have the ability to do that, but take the time in order to have that kind of meaningful engagement, that meaningful outreach. So it has to be deliberate. It cannot be something where, our doors are open, you can come and talk to us anytime you want. That's not going to happen. The police have to make a very concentrated effort to do that outreach, start building relationships, start to make, not only empower themselves, but empower the community. Community understanding has a voice, and we're listening to the voice, and it's defining what the role of the police are in the community. A lot of times police will tell you, this is what we're going to do for you, or this is our plan and strategy for fighting crime, and never give the community an opportunity to say, that's not my priority. That's not my issue. That's not what I want you to be doing. This is what I need you to do. So there has to be that partnership, and you've got to remove that power dynamic that's always existed with the police and the power dynamic over the community. That has to be removed and has to come away. And the police have to be an equal partner, whether it's with the community or with themselves. The piece we didn't talk about, we keep on talking about the external aspects of this model. We haven't talked about the internal aspects of this model, because everything we talk about in terms of the way you should be thinking about police relationship in the community, its collaboration with partners, has to represent itself and has to be replicated inside the organization. That's the piece that Ricky's working on in terms of officer wellness, building officer resilience, making sure officers stay well, make sure officers can deal with the trauma. Not only are we doing trauma-informed care for victims, but we're also making sure that our officers are being attended to in terms of making sure that trauma does not stress them out, does not depress them, does not feel them fatigued, doesn't feel them undervalued. But again, the organization is demonstrating that we are empowering those officers, and we really want to make sure that the culture inside the organization empowers them, makes them resilient, and helps them thrive in an environment. So it's got to be, those two things have to be running simultaneously with one another, and those two dimensions are key. And when we talk about that connectivity, we talk about officer wellness being something that connects throughout the entire organization, including its disciplinary system. How is that connected to being and promoting officer wellness? And it's not being seen as a punitive or disciplinary tool within an organization, but part of a larger, comprehensive, holistic approach in terms of what officer wellness look like, including self-care, but also including the things that the police department is doing to make sure it's taking care of its own employees within the organization. And Ricky, I don't know if you want to add anything on that piece before we go too far away.
Not specific, because I think we're going to talk about it in a little the wellness, but I think you said something that struck a chord for me. I don't know that there's anybody here who would disagree with this, but when you have time, I think that time, staffing, that ability to really be able to get out of your patrol car, get into your communities, go into the businesses, meet the business owners, meet the families, that time for engagement. And that's what we're talking about. I mean, I couldn't agree more that community policing is community engagement. But when we engage with people and we get to know them, you start to care about them. And it's that engagement and the caring part that comes from this relationship building. It doesn't happen overnight, don't get me wrong, but the end result of all that is, an ownership of the problems as being a collective ownership. It's not your problem, it's not my problem, it's our problem. And I mean, I would just add that because I think that whole structure in the, community engagement collaboration part of police work is it really is the driving force behind what makes a good community, what makes a good police department, what makes good everything. I mean, if you know people and you like them, you're going to own each other's problems and you're going to do everything in your power to help each other out with the problems. And going back to what Bob said, and I think we'll talk about a little later, right down to the ability to take care of our police officers, internally and externally.
Thank you all. Any other questions, comments? I like the conversation, the notion about the business model that you talked about, Bob. I think that we're always really good about our mission and our goals, but then how do we actually apply our business to that mission and goals is an interesting conversation. We also talked about how hiring has not changed over the years, and I'm wondering what kinds of trends you're starting to see that talks about hiring in a different and a better way. And what are folks seeing out there on the type of officer that's starting to come in the door? Is that starting to evolve and change?
Well, it is changing. And in fact, it's interesting because there are some agencies that are doing something that they think is progressive that there have been other agencies that have been doing for decades. And that is that instead of just using police department or city, human resource personnel to do the interviews and the hiring, they actually have a member of the public that sits on the panel, a community member, and not necessarily somebody from an organization, but it could just be somebody that, has expressed an interest and they come in and they can participate and have a voice in, I like this person. She'd be really great or he'd be really great. So there are small things like that, but there also are a lot of efforts to change those KSAs I was referring to. How are they kind of rethinking what they want in the car, interacting with the people and engaging with the people as we've been talking about? And a lot of agencies now are moving to that. They're reviewing their KSAs. They're going back and saying, let's start fresh. Let's take a new look. Let's redefine what we want. And they're involving the community in that process. It's not just the police department saying, let's reimagine this. They're involving the community. They're engaging with the community to come in and say, if you had to write the top 10 things that are important to you about these police officer responding to a call that you might have, what do you want? And all of a sudden these things can begin to appear. And the other reason that's important is because there's not an agency really across this country, in the most part, I'm generalizing, but very few who are not experiencing the problems with recruiting, hiring, and retention. And a lot of it has to do with the negative impact that some of the social issues over the last several years have had on how people view policing and police officers. So there are a lot of young people that are being discouraged from joining this profession because of what they see. So those KSAs also have to speak to them. So that's another reason for why you want to try and have that effort. It's not just to try and make sure that the people coming in are open-minded to what it is that we're all discussing in terms of reimagining and changing the processes and the philosophy, but you've got to be able to appeal to those individuals that also would say, that's for me. I would like to do that. I'd like to take a more proactive role in engaging with the community and doing a different style of policing. You have to appeal to that as well. So it's kind of a twofold reason for doing that. But that's just one example, and I'll open the floor to my colleagues to weigh in as well with other things. But we're seeing those things across the country occurring.
I know Levy's
And also,
yeah.
Sorry, just a moment. Notice that Levy has his virtual hand up. Sorry.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I can't see those. So thank you. And I noticed Cindy's hand as well. So Levy, I'll start there.
Yeah, I think I have two questions that I think are related. One, just curious if there are any models or best practices out there of departments allowing any paid time for officers to go out and do volunteering in the community, like coaching, or like if they want to be a football coach or some other way of encouraging officers to, and not just officers, but just personnel from departments in general to go out there and be engaged in the community, so that to start making those connections sort of off the clock without the uniform or without the fire, but still being really deep in the community. And the other question is if there are any best practices out there that you've seen about departments proactively screening out personnel with affiliations to white supremacist groups or any far-right groups that are out there. And if any of those questions are something that will be covered later, or we need to get back to, that's totally fine.
Well, I certainly know that to the last point, yeah, the agencies are now, they're doing the background, and they're also looking at social media. And that wasn't on the radar 5 years ago. That wasn't part of the protocol to go and take a look at somebody's Facebook page when they were getting ready to hire people. The most progressive agencies, that's part of the process now. They go back and they look at Facebook, their Instagram feeds, anything else that they can see that these folks are posting, to be able to see if they can really learn something that may not be coming forth under a regular background checks. That's part of one of the things. As far as the first question goes, there are some agencies that have what are called those police athletic leagues programs, where there are full-time officers assigned to do things like run these youth programs, whether they be sports or even homework-based programs, where officers are helping interact with teachers and others as they're putting on homework centers after school for some kids. So, I mean, there are some agencies that are allowing their officers on a paid basis to be able to do that because they're carving that out. But again, that means that an agency has enough people to handle those calls for service while still giving them time to do their other their community engagement, if you will. But then there are also any number that are also, they may, for example, during a promotional process, give credits to individuals in the promotional process, scoring packages, if you will, if they can prove that they're actually doing some of these outside volunteer, coaching programs, homework centers, volunteering at food banks, and whatever the case may be. There are some efforts to try and do that, but that's still kind of in a nascent stage. But if you ask me, from what I've heard tonight, it certainly sounds to me like you're a community that would be open to something like that. Bob?
Yeah, I think the thing that's going to be critical, just to kind of augment what Rob is talking about, is this notion of making sure officers have that uncommitted time and how they use that uncommitted time. And that engagement looks very different in a variety of different ways. It can't be a special unit that's engaging in that kind of activity. It's got to be the officers that people are going to have contact with day in and day out, because they've got to build a relationship, not just with those officers, but the officers have to build a relationship with them. So that's why it's going to be baked into the process of how police officers are engaging in that community in non-adversarial, non-controversial ways, but are being very deliberate about making sure they're doing that outreach and starting to make that first step forward to actually establish those relationships with the entire community, not selective pockets of the community, but the entire community, especially those communities that have felt like that relationship has not existed before. So it's really making sure that they're persistent about it, but also that they're having that ongoing relationship so that things can change in terms of that humanitarian aspect of how people interact with one another.
And Cindy has her hand, and then we'll go to Deputy.
I think this is really good. And when you talk about engagement, I mean, even homework club, that is engaging. And an example of that happened here in our community in my program over 10 years ago was the Gladiator program. There were street youth downtown causing problems, so law enforcement thought. There were law enforcement issues, so the kids thought. And once the downtown unit came to our agency and said, hey, we want to talk to your kids, and we said, well, not really. Let's figure out a way to do this. We had an arrangement of how the officers were going to be able to come into our daily youth center. And it was not uniformed, and you're coming in and we're going to create relationships. And how that evolved over time, the same officers came every Thursday. The same kids showed up every Thursday, and it became a workout club. Well, before long, it wasn't Officer McDermott that was coming. It was Pat. Pat's here. We're going to go running. And this relationship started, and I don't know how the crime went down, but I know the youth started telling the officers, I saw today this happened, and this is something that you need to address. And so the relationship was, I'm not fearful of cops anymore, and the cops weren't afraid of our kids anymore, or whatever the beginning was. And we started to have these relationships. That club is still going. The DA's office participates, Salem PD downtown unit participates, other officers participate, but that's kind of what we're talking about, that ongoing changing your relationships. So it's a consistent basis and you start to understand the side from both angles. And on that point, I think there's really 5 things that are coming to me as our engagement strategy. And it's not just law enforcement that has to do this. To Oni's point and to our other points of the community, our neighborhoods, our businesses, our neighbors, we all have to think conscientiously, holding oneself accountable to see what's necessary and what needs to be done. We have to have the courage to take the right action at the right time. And whether that's law enforcement taking a more enforcement action or a less enforcement action with, different strategies. If it's the community stopping and engaging and talking things through, we have to have the courage to have those conversations. And then you have to have empathy. You have to have empathy about where that other person is and understanding what's going on so that you can make that relationship connection. And then helpfulness. If something's wrong, you've got to be able to see that you can help to meet that. And how are we, the department, going to engage to meet some of those identified needs, and how are we going to help to fix it? Because that's what we're going to do. Once we fix it, then it is no longer a problem. We have a stronger relationship, and maybe those things don't happen in the future for calls for service. And then finally, it's just humility. We've got to see humanity. We're all the same. We all have differences, but if we get together on the same with empathy and courage and honesty and moving forward, that's what we're asking here. And that's what I think, and I know that our department has done over time in different areas. And I have been the benefactor, and the kids in my homeless and at-risk program were the benefactor of that type of relationship building. And I'm proud to say that that is still going on.
Those are great examples, Cindy, and I'll just make a very brief comment that when you empower these officers to do the very things you're speaking about as they engage the community, whether it's a homework center, whatever the case may be, they will surprise you with some of the stuff they come up with. But one quick example, we had a female officer who was working in a very, very challenged neighborhood, both with poverty and with gang issues. And she realized that really what some of the young women in that neighborhood were suffering from was a lot of self-esteem issues. They began hanging around with guys that they shouldn't be hanging around with just because of self-esteem issues. And what she got this, and nobody ever would have thought of this before, 10 years before. She volunteered and was putting on classes in the neighborhood to show these young women how to apply makeup and how to dress and stuff like this. This is not something you're going to get from an old school lieutenant, at the police department. It was one of the most successful community policing programs, but she was empowered to come up with the idea and do it. She showed that empathy, showed the engagement, and it had a huge impact in the community, in that neighborhood especially.
That's a great example. Deputy Burke.
Okay, so I kind of want to go back to, I guess Scotty kind of got this conversation started with a question about freeing up officers' time and really being able to identify adequate resources. And I think we've talked about a lot of great ideas and thoughts, but it all comes back to the same thing, which is if officers don't have the free time to go do and engage and be part of this program, I don't even want to say programs, it's just a mindset, it's what we do. So if we don't have the free time to be able to allow officers to go be involved in these types of events, that's the first problem. And we can't resolve that problem. We can't solve that problem with today's resources. And none of us, I think, are foolish enough to think that when we get done with this process and the audit comes back and whatever the recommendations are, if there's a recommendation to hire 60 people, we all know that's not going to happen. We know it's not going to happen tomorrow. We know it's not going to happen 2 years from now. And it's about how do you put a plan in place? And I think that's when we start taking a look at the documents that are in front of us today. It's one of the key pieces of what we're looking at is how do we put a strategic plan in place that allows us to grow the organization to the place that it needs to be. And we all recognize the fact that we haven't kept up over the years. The fact that Salem Police Department has as many or fewer officers than it did 10 years ago, and the population has grown to where it is, and working in the community has become that much more complex, we're way behind the curve. And so to support Scotty's question, and I guess to get more to the point is, should we expect to see recommendations that talk about staffing levels that take us above the 1.01 per thousand per capita? And that's, I think that's, Scotty, I don't want to reiterate what you're saying. You can ask it again yourself, but I think that's the question is, how do we get from, the national, and we can talk about what the goals are to have 2 per thousand in order to really do engagement, which is not going to be attainable for us. But how do we get it from above 1.01?
And just to clarify, I know that we are way below. What I was wondering is, in your experience in doing these audits, are you seeing a difference, a tangible difference? Because I think that's what we're looking for, is a tangible difference, something we can measure. Have you seen, 2 or 3 years post, evaluation or whatever you called it, of these agencies? Have you seen a difference? And is the difference correlated with the number of officers that they have? Because I would think, just looking at it just as a plain and simple, just taking a very simple look at it, you'd say, well, if you had more officers and you engage the community more and started sending officers on less calls that don't require an officer, then naturally the officers would have more time to take on these recommendations. So I was just wondering, has that been seen in practice?
So let me tie Jody's comments, the deputy chief's comments, Sky's comments, and Cindy's comments all together. And what we talk about is a business model. We talk about the notion that and I think Deputy probably said that you can't do this overnight. You really need to evolve into it. You really need to start to think about what the organization is going to look like and what it's going to involve too. In essence, we talk about envisioning and vision of the police department. Where is it going to be in 3 to 5 years? And then when you understand what that vision is, then where's the policing philosophy and the mission that goes to pushing the department in that direction to achieve that vision? And over those 4 years, year by year, incrementally building the organization to move towards that vision to achieve it, but also being able to demonstrate in very concrete ways, what are the deliverables? What are you going to get in return? And Cindy made the point before, it's not a straight point from police dealing with violent crime, it's police building relationships with the community, and the byproduct is safer communities, right? So it's understanding that it's that relationship that has to be in place if you really want to have meaningful impact in terms of the environment, quality of life, safety, and public safety. And the community needs to know that it can trust the police, work with the police, and have those kinds of relationships so that they're actually part of working in that solution. So the point being is there's an obligation to make a business case that if you make these investments, this is what you'll see in terms of the returns you'll get on those investments. Then it's up to the community to decide, are those investments worth it? And is the return I'm getting for those investments really the way I want to go with the organization? And so, our position's been in the agencies that we've worked on where they've done this, they've demonstrated pure efficacy in terms of that approach, in terms of giving the officers the time and the ability and empowerment to reach out and work with the community, build those relationships, and show a significant change in not only the community relationships and the relationship within those communities, but again, just the quality of life within those communities because of those relationships that are going on and the organizations that they're empowering because they're working collaboratively together. So it is about that business case and not just simply saying, well, I need 60 officers. It's saying, here's what we need to do. This is what we want to achieve. Here's how we're going to get there. Here are the investments I need along the way. And here are the milestones every year that I'm going to meet to demonstrate that we're returning on the investment that you put into working with the police department. So those are the things you need to think about. I'll tell you, there's no magic pill. There's no way to say, well, tomorrow you're going to be a brand new police agency. You really have to do some fundamental changes because the organization is doing this for decades. And so it's going to take time to evolve. It's going to take time to build relationships in communities that didn't really have been, for the longest time, have not had good relations with the police. It takes time. So you really need to do it in a very measured way, in a very deliberate way.
Scotty, there's also something else. You can see it in reverse as well. We've seen agencies out there that have made the effort to try and do this community engagement, to free those officers up and have empowered them. And then for a variety of different reasons, it could be budget cuts or whatever the case may be, laid off, they've pulled back, they've stopped hiring or something, and the numbers are going backwards. And then that's when you see crime start to go up. And then what happens when crime starts to go up? Then all of a sudden the community is upset about the crime, so they start hammering on the police department to drive the crime down again. Then the officers are going from call to call again, and they're forgetting the philosophy, and they're losing that human touch all over again, and then they're right back to where they started from. So it's not just looking at how the changes positively are occurring when you're increasing the ability of the officers to do that, but we see where agencies that are trying to do that and they're cut back, fall behind, and kind of go right back to where they started from, and they're dehumanizing the interactions between the officers again, because they're just going from call to call to call. So it works both ways. You can see the
One of the things we see in terms of what's in it for the officers, we see the officers seeing a greater sense of job satisfaction. They feel like they're accomplishing something, right? Why they came in this business in the first place, and not just feel like they're being beaten down because they're answering calls of service, but now they're really making it, they're really effectuating change. They're making a difference. They're having impact. They have a sense of ownership, not just with the geographic areas they're working in, but the community in which they have touch points with. So that's you know, so it's really a true collaboration between the external and internal benefits that take place when you actually start to think about policing in this way.
Yeah. Thank you for wrapping that around. Oni, I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, you know, I understand that that things take time. I can't tell you how many times I've sat in a meeting and I've heard of the five-year strategic plan that's going to take place with these outcomes, and I, as a Black woman, you know, you hear about these plans that are going to take place that are going to make a difference. I think there's some trust that needs to happen. We're talking about building relationships. How are you going to build trust with a community that doesn't trust you? Mm-hmm. With a community, there's a sense of, when I first joined a board, I said, you don't get a lot of reports from the Black community because they don't think anything is going to happen or it's going to make a difference. So there's no trust there, right? We don't want another program. We don't really need another program. What we need is we need a promise that when you stop our Black sons and our Black daughters, that you're going to see them as equal. You're going to see them as human. You're not going to assume things about them that would automatically put them in danger. So it's a mindset. You talked about going outside as well as inside, and then you talked about the police wellness, and I think the police wellness it goes even deeper than that, of what you think about other communities, because if you don't explore what you really think or what you've been conditioned to believe about other communities, and if that doesn't change, and then when you interact with them, they're going to know. I don't want a program. I want a promise that I can rest at night. If my sons get stopped, that they're going to be okay.
And Oni, that's a key dimension to this as well. There has to be a community component to it, where the community is not attached to the police, but really as acting as independent agents within their neighborhoods and working with the police, but also being willing to set the parameters for the police in those neighborhoods. So it's the community that has to be empowered as well. It can't just be the police we're empowering. It's got to be the community that feels empowered, that feels like they are being heard, that people are listening and want to hear what they want, that they're setting their priorities in terms of how the community should be policed, defining the way the community wants to be policed, and not the police deciding that it's going to do it in a certain way. So it's really important to have that ongoing collaboration. And it's hard because initially the community's been used to the police telling them what they're going to do or policing them in a certain way where it becomes oppressive or suppressive, right? So how do the police back away? How do they now rely upon the community to be telling them how they want that relationship and what that relationship should look like, right? And it can't be the police co-opting the community. It really has to be two independent parties coming together, agreeing to work together, but also agreeing to understand and honor each other in terms of how that relationship exists and works. It's a process. So that's really what's important in terms of being deliberate about the process. And unlike many other strategic plans, it really should be designed to hold the police executive accountable and saying, this is what I need, this is what I'm going to deliver, here are my milestones, and making sure that the community is saying, okay, this is what you promised. Now demonstrate to us in very tangible ways that you're meeting those promises. So it's got to be a very tangible roadmap for moving from one year to the next, and then holding the police department accountable, staying true to that roadmap. Also making sure that every time you don't have an administration change, that all of a sudden it's a whole new priority, right? Unfortunately, Salem is not in that position. It's got a brand new chief that, for all intents and purposes, is going to be there for the next 5 years to really set that course to get the department moving in the right direction. So you don't not worrying about that constant turnover in police administration and moving the organization in a very different direction, which then sets it back, right? So it's really making sure the department moves in a forward direction and stays consistent, regardless of who the administrator is of that department, because you've now got a tangible document the community's holding the police department accountable to.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm mindful we're headed into 10 after 6, and I think you can see why we wanted a little bit longer conversation tonight. This has been really, really helpful. Also, I recently was listening to the conversations, the SRO conversations that the school district is having and the youth group that they have engaged. And I look at the outcomes that youth group has recommended, and I think in some ways it wraps up some of what we're saying as well, that they had 4 recommendations, and that recommendation was accountability, relationship training, mentorship, and student engagement. And I think putting that lens on several items that we've talked about is actually it's actually helpful for me to think about how we actually want our work applied as we keep moving forward, and how we can trust and honor those relationships. Some of those words that I heard talked about here today. I like that lens and thinking it through a little bit more. And I hear what you're saying on the budget and the numbers and the how many officers we have per 1,000. And I think that's a good conversation for us to keep on the table. And for us to think about as a community when we think about our crime trends, what we're funding as well. We have agreed to some level of crime in our community, and what kind of conversations do we have around that? So I hear you, our law enforcement partners, talk about that budget. I think we need some more time to keep working through this to make sure that we're able to support in a way that that we can talk through a little bit more. So thank you for that conversation too. Is there any other comments before we probably should move on from our agenda? I appreciate this conversation. Learning about other communities really helps us as we're thinking about our community and our expectations going forward. I'm thankful that we've moved into the community engagement because we too have a commitment to our law enforcement partners that we're talking about. Anything else? I'm going to move on to the agenda items if that's fair for everyone, if you're ready to do that.
It's interesting to me, Jody. It's actually a perfect segue. This conversation has been really enlightening and reinforcing to me some of these key themes that are in the document. And it's nice to see, I think, a lot of this conversation reflected. And so it would be a great time to pause and have that reflection, I think.
All right, so next on the agenda, we are moving into the key audit themes and concepts. And is this where you want us to look at the document that you've sent out to us?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So just to kind of bring you all up to date as you're starting to pull out that document is since our last meeting, we've had 10 distinct focus group meetings over the time, and really spoken to 42 different officers within the department. Some of the same officers we talked to in the first round, but really with a different focus and really on specific topical areas, which I'm going to run through real quick just so that you know where we've gone and helped inform these key themes in this document going forward. I just got to make sure I bring it back up again. So during those 2 weeks, we really focused on internal affairs. We focused on the RMS system and the crime analysis within the department's capacity and capabilities. We looked at the domestic violence focus group and had a conversation about what that group does and how it functions and how it's connected to the rest of the department. We talked about the officer wellness focus group. We had a serious conversation with folks that are involved in that area, but also really trying to understand where it is and what extent it's working. We had an extensive conversation around youth engagement in a focus group. And that's not just in terms of intervention programs or preventative programs, but also in terms of engaging youth that may need services, right? So really more broad brush, more broader perspective in terms of that area. Crowd control and demonstrations, two of our colleagues that are not on this call are actually focusing on that area, and that's where their expertise is. And we are talking about the training discipline within the organization and the overall written directive system. What we've done is we've given you a document last time entitled Key Themes and Concepts Phase 1. Based on those meetings and interviews that we had that Brian was talking about earlier, we developed a series of questions that came out of all those conversations. What you'll see in this second document is really the byproduct of our conversations of those focus groups and the questions that came out of those conversations. You'll not see the same questions repeated between the two documents. So if there was something that you were concerned about that may have come up in the earlier document, those questions are asked in the earlier document, but this was really more focused in terms of that internal assessment of the department, that audit of the department, that we actually developed 9 key themes and identified those series of questions that we are going to answer with respect to the audit report as it relates to those themes. And as Courtney kind of pointed out, if you look at the themes, so for example, the first one is need for increased Salem Police Department community engagement, outreach assessment protocols of current and future policing practices to ensure department efforts incorporate and or consider best practices in the application of a comprehensive and coordinated methods of consistent community policing principles. So we talked about this notion about community engagement, community outreach, and really are moving away from this concept of this notion about a community policing program, but really how is the department doing those or accomplishing that key theme in a way that's comprehensive across the entire organization. And you'll see the questions that kind of follow or flow out from that theme within that document. The second one is the need to creating comprehensive strategic plan to guide SPD, describing its overall vision for the future of SPD, describing how SPD will fulfill its mission, defining its goals and core values in achieving the overall plan. So it goes back to that whole notion of that conversation we had with respect to a comprehensive strategic plan, but very specific in terms of what it's going to do, where it's going to go, and what it's going to achieve, and communicating that to the community and making sure there's consensus on the part of the community that it agrees with that theme. So it's not the department just developing its own strategic plan absent from the community, but if it's true to this notion of community engagement and outreach, community is intimately involved in that process in terms of developing and helping structure that strategic plan, both internal within the organization and also among the different communities. CM3 expands and enhances the analytical and data collection capabilities SPD to help reduce and eliminate crime and quality of life issues through proactive problem solving efforts. So that notion of really making a difference and not being driven by 911, not answering calls for service, but really taking control of those calls for service, really engaging with the community to manage those things that are repetitive in nature or chronic in nature. And the thing that's astonishing in policing, and it goes back to the conversation you had earlier, is that the police will just run from call to call to call without really trying to figure out why are we going back to these same locations 20 times. What's the underlying causation? A lot of times it has nothing to do with criminal justice, has nothing to do with law. It has to do with people needing services, and it manifests itself, and the crimes that are taking place in those locations are symptomatic of something that's much deeper that needs to be addressed and can't be addressed by the police alone in terms of going through that process. But without having that capability or the analytical capability, without having that engine within the organization to help inform how it uses its resources, not having that ability to communicate to its outside constituents and boards and commissions and community, it really is, it's a day-to-day operation opposed to really being a deliberate operation and really being an informed operation in terms of where it's going and how it's doing things. So that theme is key. It's an area that we spent a lot of time looking at. Brian is really the one that's been kind of focusing on that theme area. Theme 4 was to establish and enhance SPD's capabilities in providing levels of accountability and transparency to the community. And again, there's a series of questions that flow out of that in terms of what we're going to be answering with respect to the audit report as it relates to that theme. 5, to expand and enhance the current SPD programs designed to provide for a comprehensive and integrated approach which effectively addresses SPD wellness and resiliency within the department. That's Ricky's area in terms of talking about officer wellness going forward. And then theme 6, align SPD operational directive system to incorporate the department's core values into its policies, procedures, and its actual practices, so that the policy and procedures are not a set of documents, but really are being carried out, and there's consistency between what policy and procedures say and what the actual practices look like out in the field among the officers. 7 is to enhance and promote SPD's operational practices of community accountability, outreach, engagement, transparency, and partnerships/collaboration. And 8 is to enhance the recruiting and hiring process to be more collaborative and inclusive of the Salem community and reflective of SPD's community engagement plan. The one piece that we were not able to get to because we ran out of time, and that focus group is still working on it, was crowd control and protest. But you'll see the same type of thing where we're going to have a theme statement and then a series of questions that flow out of those interviews that are helping inform us doing the audit in terms of going forward. I didn't know if there was any questions, and I don't know if Brian wanted to, because Brian and Ricky really worked hard on this document in terms of formulating the questions and making sure we tried to capture everything we thought needs to be part of addressing those different theme areas. Brian?
Bob, only one comment. We went over phase 1 document on our last meeting, and I just want to reinforce that this is not separate from that document. This is in support and coordination with. So these really are overlaying documents from 2 different perspectives, or looking at some different questions to help guide the final report. So even though one was community focused, one was department focused, they both overlap and support one another. So I just want to make sure that that was reinforced.
Hey, Ricky? Nothing? I was remiss. I didn't thank Deputy Chief Burke and particularly Lieutenant Aguilar. They did yeoman's work in terms of pulling all these meetings together for us. We had 5 and 6 and 7 people involved in those meetings. So they really were thoughtful about who they brought together in those focus groups and really supported us in terms of really doing that deep dive we needed to do in terms of each of those focus or topical areas. So again, I want to thank them. Ashley, I want to thank Robert. Robert feels bad because he hasn't quite finished this survey. He's working with the unsheltered population. The work that they're doing is really invaluable to us. And I don't want them to feel that kind of pressure. So I want to thank Ashley. I want to let you know, I've already thanked Robert for the efforts and he's still working on it, but I also want to thank you too.
Hey, Bob, I'd feel awfully dirty if I took the credit for the work that Debbie did. So I'm going to tell you that you sent it to me and I sent it to her and she made it happen. So thanks for.
We might have known that. No, just kidding.
I just had to say it because if I didn't, well, I just had to.
Yeah. Thank you to all of you. And when we left our last meeting, we had just sent out the survey to the officers. So I hope that they are all feeling like they also have a seat at the table as well. So.
And again, I want to thank Scotty. We had a fantastic return on the survey. It was unbelievable. I know it was a collective effort of the administration, but also the union really stepping in and encouraging the membership to give us the response that they did. It was overwhelming in terms of the amount of folks that did respond to that survey. So again, Scotty, thank you very much. We really appreciate the effort. We're just getting that survey back now. So we'll be sharing aspects of that in our report, and also making sure that we acknowledge the fact that the department really gave us their input. So we really want to make sure we heard from the entire department.
Hey, is it still open? You want me to send out one last reminder or?
No, we closed it. So
okay,
I think we closed it as of January 8th.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
If it's okay, I'll just step in since we're on survey topics and it's kind of related. I just would like everyone to know that we have 139 stories that have been shared through the website link on the whatever we're calling it now webpage for the audit. And I'm going to be leaving that open, just taking a snapshot of the responses to date, 139. We haven't had anyone contribute anything new since January 2nd. But I'm still going to be leaving it open and just putting out some kind of an update on what we've heard so far, and with a reminder that it's open and appreciation for everyone who's contributed.
That's great. I'm glad to hear that. I think all of us, as we talk to folks, folks are just learning about the effort. And so continuing to keep that open gives an open channel for folks to keep commenting. So thank you for that. Okay, we have about 9 minutes left, and I know we want to talk about next steps.
So I wanted to kind of talk about where we're going from here. I need to share with the group that I'll be stepping away from the project, and my colleague and ably bodied boss, actually, Rob Davis, is willing to come in and take on the project. So Rob has been doing this work for a long, long period of time. He's going to assume the role of project manager. You are not going to see any difference in terms of the work that we're doing in terms of going forward. You know, it was a difficult decision I had to make. This is one project I was very deeply invested in. I really enjoyed working with the steering committee. And as I was saying to Gretchen early on, the best part of the project is meeting people and talking to people and interviewing people. So I got the best part of the project, quite honestly, in terms of, selfishly, in terms of being on the front end. But we are at a turning point now in terms of the project where we're moving from the interview phase, collecting data, reading documents now, and moving into development of the audit report. And that's where Rob's going to take a leadership role with Ricky and Brian in terms of developing the audit report now in the form of key findings and the recommendations that are going to be coming forward. We need to think about and talk about with the steering committee what that looks like in terms of going forward in preparation for the presentation to the working group of this city council, and also the community groups we agreed that we were going to also present to as well. So going forward, we've actually broken, and you'll see it on the agenda, the topic areas down and actually collapsed some of the things with respect to BIPOC community, youth engagement, the unsheltered population, victims of domestic violence, into a subcategory under a broader umbrella of community engagement. So that's all going to fall in there, but there are still going to be very subject topics, very specific topics. And again, what you're going to see in the audit report is the connectivity to that broader theme in terms of going forward. So that work is going to start to go forward. Our next meeting right now tentatively is for February 17th. I've been talking to Jody and Courtney about, you know, is there a need to maybe insert another meeting? We'll probably continue to have that conversation because there's a lot of territory to cover between now and then getting ready for the presentation to the city council and the working group meeting on March 15th and those series of meetings that follow during that week. Rob, I don't know if you wanted to.
Yeah, I hope that everybody understands that Bob's stepping back from this project is his choice. He's been doing a phenomenal job, not just on this project, but he's been with us for several years. And Bob, I don't want to speak for you or, you know, go too far out on your reasons for why you're stepping away from this, but suffice it to say that I've been extremely grateful to Bob Haas, for not only for what he's done on this project, but for helping to set a standard for agencies across this country for the last several years with us. So please make no mistake that there's no backstory to all of this other than wishing that we could hang on to Bob. So
thank you.
If you want to say more, Bob, feel free, but I won't.
I'm good. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Bob, and if I can say on behalf of the steering team, thank you for the time that you have given to this effort. You've made an impact on our community for even the short time that you've been with us here. I just want to thank you so much. Your guidance is really important and it's made an impact, and we appreciate it and wish you all the best as you.
Thank you, Jordan.
As you move on. So thank you.
So I think we stayed on time.
I think we did. And so we may be reaching out to the steering team between now and the next meeting about conversations about potentially having another meeting in between there so that we can make sure and accomplish the work as we move forward. Is it fair to say that we will see some other documents between now and our next meeting that we'll want to make sure that we take time away to read and be prepared for? We'll start to see another round of information sharing, looking at Hilliard Hines or Courtney as steering team members, just to know for expectations. I
myself will be learning that over the next couple of days. I make sure I'm caught up to speed. So stay tuned. And I'll work. In fact, Courtney, I think we're speaking tomorrow, as a matter of fact.
Yes, early. I think what we're trying to do is balance bringing you together in at the right time with the right stuff. We'd like to avoid bringing you together without having some meaningful conversation. And so that's where the tension is how much time do we need to bring those pieces together before we bring you back together. So we'll be mindful of that moving forward and let you know as soon as we know where we are. Thanks so much.
Knowing we have quite a bit to do between now and the March meeting is also the sandwich, I suppose, I guess I could say. So, all right. Anyone have any last comments?
Can I just make a quick point to say, obviously, we don't want to take anything that we don't have complete agreement before when we go to the council work session. But I would also like to just say we shouldn't take a polished, finished product to the city council in the work session either, because the purpose of the work session is really to share what we've learned and what we know and the key findings. So it can still have an iteration after. It doesn't have to be packed with bow and ready. So just to everybody, we're all fine. We're gonna make it.
Thank you. Steering team, any last comments? Thank you. Cindy, please.
I'd just like to say that this was the most meaningful meeting that we've had outside of initial interviews and conversations. I really liked the dialogue. That was really great. And I'm looking forward to even these 2 phase documents being updated with our new titles, our new words of community engagement instead of community policing.
All right, with that, we'll close our Community Engagement Audit Steering Committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Good night, Bob.
Good night.